So I want to take some time here to talk about Dr. J. And I'm getting more into basketball here, and I think I'm kind of understanding why there is this impetus to do so, because I'm looking at the dunk, I think in particular, as an aesthetic act, and the importance of the aesthetic act in terms of the embodied revelation of the powers of being, and specifically through Dr. J as a fluidity and an athletic fluidity. And so we've talked all about the will as it's translated through the human being and the genetic organism as a survivalism, right? Consumption, reproduction, perpetuation of the organism. And when we're talking about the aesthetic act of the ball sport, again, as we discussed with Heraclitus, and the aeon as a child at play with colored balls, we're looking at the ritual hyperspace of the translation of that will, that essential life-giving primordial thrust, which is present in all things and is as the universal, but it's just being translated genetically and metabolically down through scales, being translated in terms of stellar nucleosynthesis down through scales, star systems, again, which are feeding metabolically the organisms and systems which populate those star systems. We're looking at a return to that ontological source of the will, which is a form of cosmological expression. The aesthetic object, again, whether that's basketball or baseball, we're looking at a pursuit of and a possession with and a unity with that aesthetic object, which becomes much closer with Dr. J, especially in the if you watch the video or the clips of the Rock the Baby dunk that Dr. J creates, right? Again, this is a form of embodied creation, aesthetic witnessing, and aesthetic presence. The unity of the will manifests through the human being, right? A unity of the will, which is emergent through the human being. This, I'm just checking something real quick. This purity or purification of the will through the aesthetic practice of the ball sport. Again, in that primordial unity with the Heraclitean axiom of the aeon as a child at play with colored balls. And we discussed in the last essay just how that translates, right? Down through the genetic structure of the nucleotide, down through the atomic structure, down through the molecular structure, down through the solar system structure, right? And the way of translating that in the human sense, ontologically, unconsciously, and implicitly and systematically, is through the ball sport, which at mid-century in the United States of America hyper-accelerates through the triumvirate of baseball, basketball, and football. The primordial unity of that aesthetic act, and then again with the difference between basketball and baseball is that basketball, the ball itself, especially in the act of dunking, as Dr. J manifested as a absolute symbolic representation of the act of dunking, which is to say Dr. J is the primary archetype of the act of dunking in terms of the modern incarnation of it, right? The precedent of it, but also the perfection of it in his aesthetic athletic unity with the ball itself, the unity with the aesthetic object, where the technology of the basketball and again the technology of the human body are subordinated and primordinated into the absolute metabolic structure of the primordial will of the universe itself proper. The human being itself as a genetic architecture is sublimated through the primordial act of the will, and by extension the technological object, the aesthetic object through which the primordial will is ritualized and realized, is also incorporated in terms of a perfect fluid athletic movement through the realization of that essential will in the aesthetic act of rocking the baby, cradling the basketball, and dunking it in this movement of an embodied dance which necessarily transcends and is prior to the astrophysical, is prior to the quantum mechanic, right? To understand that when we're talking about the perfection of athletic culture and devotional movement in this metaphysical movement itself proper of the child at play with colored balls, this metaphysical principle, this essential characteristic of being, which is manifest down through all scales, right? Again, all the way from the astrophysical to the biomolecular and the quantum mechanical, right? As a field which unifies that entire scalar structure of universal existence and being itself. When we're looking at that unity embodied within culture, within the actual ritual practice of the physical embodiment of this archetypal reality, we're looking at the truth incarnate, the absolute purpose of the universal in terms of that unity across all scales being and becoming manifest consciously through the perfection of this athletic, aesthetic, devotional act of the unity in play. The aesthetic perfection and mastery in play, which is the ritual athletic movement, which is itself grace. It's the gesture of grace which interlocks and interlocutes the human being with the universal cosmic destiny of all things, which is the character and essence of will and consciousness itself proper. The essence of being as in the essential character of the primordial identity of all that is. And so what's so fascinating and profound, I think, when you watch these videos of Dr. J, is you're actually watching this ritual devotional act of of flight culture, flight consciousness, and we're not. It's not so much again. The risk is there of literalizing that. It's flight as in airplanes or flight as in spaceships, right? This idea of transcending physical gravity. And yes, that is phenomenologically the manifestation of this principle. But really what we're looking at in terms of flight consciousness, we're looking at a liftoff of the revelation of the human being in this playful act, which is physical transcendence, right? Again, this is transcendence through the body. This is not through the hyper-intellectualization of the history of modern physics or the history of modern philosophy. This is actual embodied transcendence through the ritual performance of the physical body, which is this perfection of the unity with the devotional act of the ball, right? This unity with the aesthetic object of contemplation, which ritually reveals the cosmological essence, whether this is conscious or not in terms of the history of American civilization of ball sports, and the closeness of the ball sport as a unity of process in movement, which is so characteristic of the high aesthetic act of Dr. J dunking the ball as an acrobatic sort of ballet, or as has been described in the history of metaphysics and esoterics, a dance of the solar system, or a dance of the cosmos in terms of the planets in relationship to the sun, right? Again, this aesthetic dance of gravity, which is manifest in and as space and time as it is counted in an earthbound sense, in a geological sense. This is what creates space-time, right? So we're looking at this primordial action from which we are deducing physical principles and formulae, right? But this again is an embodied reality. This is an incarnate physical reality, which is constructing the principles of space and time, which we are ritually realizing and experiencing in a human sense. But again, the question is to ground this in terms of an embodied experience. So let me continue forth here. The idea with Dr. J is the continuity of the play in the aeon. And again, the aeon means the eternal translated through time. It's the appearance of the character of the eternal in time. Again, this is also manifested in Plato with time as the moving image of eternity. The perfection of this movement of the devotional act of play, which is ritualized and consecrated and practiced through the aperture of the cultural artifact of basketball, is itself the turning of the entire physical existence of the human being, including gravity and the physical principles which ground the cosmos, into an aesthetic act of ritual transcendence of the principles which appear to construct the real, right? Which appear to construct and ground the phenomenological conditions of the human being. This, again, is the absolute transcendental power of the aesthetic act as it is embodied and incarnate in the perfection of the athletic sporting and movement in unity with the ball. This again is the wind tunnel or the hyperspace that's possible within this aesthetic unity as it is translated in modern culture unconsciously down from the essential Heraclitean axiom. This is what is allowed or what is given to us in terms of the realization of the transcendental, right? The realization of the spiritual ontos, so the core of existence, which is made possible by the aesthetic devotional act of human consciousness, human experience, human embodiment toward that ritual unity in terms of embodied play. Let me think here. So when I'm thinking about Dr. J, I'm thinking about him as a kind of apotheosis of the spirit. And what I mean by that is that he is the possibility of the transcendence of the plane of the powers which ritually ground human existence. It is a way of returning, right, the physical, perceptible phenomenological principles which we believe to ground the human experience to their quantum mechanical primordial architecture, which is the time before space-time, right? It's the time before the ritualization of mass into predictable patterns and the grounding of waveforms into however temporal structures, which themselves are planitudes, right, with their fields of gravity, just as much as they are fields of stellar nucleosynthesis, which are translations of energetic radiation down through cosmic scales, and then create these organisms which are ritually attempting to realize the spiritual form of existence, which is this formless dimension of energetics. And to realize that formless dimension of energetics is to realize the nature and the essence and the character of the spirit itself, which is, again, elucidated in the Heraclitean axiom. This is the attempt, right? We're witnessing this dialectic between form and mass and structured energy in terms of a genetic linguistic, which is the form and formulation of the ritual aperture of the human being as it experiences everyday life, reality, and existence as a thermal ground, a geological ground, a gravitational ground, a thermonuclear ground in terms of the energy and nutrition it absorbs from the sun and the different formulations of that thermonuclear energy which are created from the sun, which are all of the species and the different characteristic forms which populate the earth, including plant life. Again, this is a totality of a phenomenological appearance of reality in which the human being is participant in, and yet intuits at the foundational and ontological core of its being itself this essential hidden character, which humanity and all of life is necessarily striving back towards in a sort of retroactive, retrograde motion back through the annals of the different space-time structures and evolutionary processes that created it, right? Which is the movement of the dandelion seed, or the overturning of different epochs on Earth in terms of species, whether that's dinosaurs or different species which oscillate in and out of extinction, flash in and out of extinction, and the tenuous genetic threads which formulate different organisms and their impulses, and the evolving, compounding complexity of the technologies which construct them and revelate them and reflect them in space-time, in an earthly sense, in relationship to the entire cosmological unfolding of the universal powers of existence, which are condensed, transmitted, and elucidated in the Heraclitean axiom. So this is a return to this pre and post gravitational state, right? This pre and post gravitational state of the character and the essence of being, which necessarily must be returned through the embodiment of the axiom at its most foundational sense and in its most foundational sense and level. And when you see this this discourse between baseball, basketball, and football in an American modern civilizational sense, you're witnessing a discourse of which of these different cultural forms in their ritual elucidation can most clearly give us the power of revelation of this essential metaphysical truth, which is it's an implicit instinctual response that the human being has to the revelation of these powers, filtered through the unity of the aesthetic object with the athlete, which is the total transmission of this primordial unity of the will, which is the elucidation and revelation of the inherent character within and as all things, right? This is the real extremity and the importance of what we're talking about. And so when we watch Dr. J rock the baby and dunk the basketball, we're witnessing this total unity of flow, which is prior to and transcendent to time via this ritual mastery of the practice and the sport of basketball and the art of dunking, which Dr. J really fundamentally introduces in a modern sense. It's something that he himself really creates and introduces as a cultural form, which is this flight of humanity, the flight of the human being, which is, in a profound sense, a ascension of the human being back toward and through history in ritual unity with the cosmological will, both in terms of its force and its character. So again, the dunking of Dr. J is fundamentally aesthetic, light, fluid, and forceless. It's actually powerless in the sense that it is entirely in flow in this ritual athletic union. It's not an exertion of force as it is a perfection of the human being in body and space and in time, moving through the perceived forces and elucidating the will-less will of the cosmos, which is the child at play with colored balls, with the inherent lightness of that character and characterization itself. So, again, this is something that we are experiencing and we're witnessing phenomenologically. We're talking about creative liberation through play as physical artistry and reunion with the cosmological principles of all of existence. It's a field of liberation, a field of consciousness, which is an act of reconciliation, a return and reunion, right, of matter to and with spirit in an embodied way, which is actually the abolition of the phenomenological appearance of matter, if you can understand that, because it is a elucidation of the fundamental principles which are underlying matter, right? Especially in regards to the breaking with gravity in a perfection in the art of the leap. And Kierkegaard talks a lot about this in terms of the leap of faith, which is that which instructs grace in creation. And what I mean by that is that the leap of faith, both in terms of an ontological movement and a physical practice, in terms of a literal leap as an athletic and aesthetic gesture, is that it is a movement into the process of the possible elucidation of this perfect unity, especially in relation to the aesthetic object, and a unity with the aesthetic object, which you could consider the translation of the basketball or the ball sport in archetypal time, which in archetypal time we're really just talking about in relationship to the Heraclitean axiom. The elucidation of that movement is the human being's attempt or process or practice of reconciling the entire history of humanity in terms of that itself being an ontological gesture towards this pending reunion of metaphysical truth, this process of unfolding across scales of this genetic recombination or molecular and chemical and elemental recombination to create in itself aesthetic objects within the universal contemplative body, which is the child at play with colored balls. Again, we discussed all the scales in which that manifests. This contemplative body, which can recourse and travel and traverse the planes of space and time to reconcile, reunify, and realign the total powers of existence through the cultural artifact, which is, again, in a Kierkegaardian sense, a redoubling of the powers of creation back upon themselves to allow for, create, and construct total realization. And this is the importance of the cultural artifact, because it is the last interlocution, it's the last interlocking piece of the total aesthetic powers and aesthetic destiny of all life to become a cultural artifact, not a process of survivalism, but a process of play, which is the step forward. It's the ontological rebirth of the human being. It is the metaphysical recursion of the human being, and it is the ontological leap, which is the paradigm shift of the human being from survival, which again is food, water, shelter, reproduction, the preservation of the biological organism, which contains the necessary genetic material to translate the human being into the next human being as a process of iterative revolution and evolution, which hopefully ontologically reveals through evolution the total powers of being itself, and thus is primordially unified beyond and through and past all time, all previous language, as a revolution and revelation of consciousness. This itself is, if you can understand it, these are orders of magnitude and these are orders of meaning. If meaning itself can be revelated directly in terms of an aesthetic, metaphysical, ontological experience in and of, as, and through the body immediately, we are looking at a total abolition of all of the existing and previous metaphorical meaning structures that defined life prior and existence prior as a ontological march towards revelation. And so this is what the embodied process, practice, and craft of the aesthetic, phenomenological, metaphysical act of Dr. J dunking the ball and rocking the baby does. This is described actually by the baseball player Mike Piazza, who was sitting in the front row and watches this action unfold. He describes it as this mass catharsis. It's this moment of this implicit and explicit understanding which occurs with every single person in the stadium at that time, right? That those who are witnessing this theatrical metaphysical act of revolution and revelation through the perfection of the practice of Dr. J, the invention and practice and perfection of the act of dunking the basketball as a fluid aesthetic movement in terms of a cosmological unity. He describes this as this mass cathartic moment, this mass exhale of this waiting tension which has existed for so long and is latent within humanity, this waiting tension which is the tension of the second coming, or the tension of the first coming, which is the ontological revelation of the true spiritual artifact of all of existence, the ontological revelation of the character and spirit and essence of consciousness and existence itself proper through the aesthetic metaphysical devotional act, which is articulated axiomatically through Heraclitus. This alignment, as you could say, this cosmic alignment, as is said, the alignment of the planets or the alignment of the stars, this scalar alignment, which is ritualized and expressed and redoubled in a Kierkegaardian sense, redoubled as in a revelation of consciousness, which is ritualized through a cultural process or form, an aesthetic form or dimension. That total symbolic architecture and symbolic order is represented into the field of consciousness as an articulation. So culture itself is language, culture itself is speech, culture itself is the artistic language and speech of being revealing itself and revelating itself. And this is the importance of an aligned culture, an aligned metaphysical culture. So this is, in the Buddhic sense, right speech, right act, right practice, because we're looking at, through ritualized possibility, whether or not this is conscious, and again, I argue in an American civilizational sense, it's unconscious. We're looking at what is realized through Dr. J in this specific moment, and several times through his continual perfection of the act of dunking, this lightness in primordial unity as a native quality of being and a native quality of spirit. Because again, this is the reunion of the essential character of the cosmos manifest through the individual in this cultural act of metaphysical revolutionary catharsis, which is the ritual revelation of being itself through the phenomenological act and process of the dunking of the basketball and the union of being at play with colored balls. Again, right, as we could discuss in a cosmological or astrophysical process, just as much as Dr. J rocking the baby, which again is an interesting metaphor in light of what we're discussing here, which was articulated improvisationally and immediately by the announcer in terms of when we look at this immanent understanding, this intuitive understanding, we're looking at, as I've discussed previously, we're not looking at an interpretation. We're looking at the powers of reality and the truth of existence to reveal themselves immanently, not reflectively in terms of intellectualization, but in that moment where the announcer intuitively, immediately understands exactly what's happening here, and he elucidates it through this cultural metaphor, this poetic metaphor, which is, in fact, profound metaphysical truth, right? Rocking the baby, Dr. J is the baby, the ball is the baby, the cosmos is the child at play with colored balls in an eternal sense, and it's being ritually realized down through scales in this precise exact moment, which is the revelation that is occurring democratically within the architecture of the stadium and all of those who witness this act across time as it has been preserved in video as a ritual act of recombination in primordial unity in the moment where the stars align, as in a scalar construct which is realized through the ritual reflective act of culture, which is the metaphysical, total metaphorical, as in a spiritually unified, poetically unified structure of existence, as we discussed with the scientific, the quote by the physicist Chen that I mentioned before, that in science we are looking for the formula of the poetry of nature, formula of the poetry of cosmos. But this is what I mean by profound, absolute, embodied, total science, in that we're talking about embodied science in terms of this ritualized practice of the embodied architecture of the motion of the dunk of Dr. J, which is an embodied physics. Athletics themselves in their most masterful unified form are an embodied physics in terms of the intuitive, ritualized, embodied understanding of the physical principles and the cosmological, in terms of quantum mechanical principles, which undergird and embody the entire universal structure, and in that sense are a implicit, unified, even unconscious, intuitive embodiment of the entire architecture of being in terms of the essential character of being, again, as we discussed with the Heraclitean axiom, the child at play with colored balls. So that is what I got, and I will catch you on the next one.